The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Courtroom 7B as Judge Margaret Harrison adjusted her reading glasses and reviewed the case file before her. It was supposed to be a straightforward custody hearing, the kind she had presided over hundreds of times during her 20-year career on the family court bench. On one side sat Richard Coleman, a corporate lawyer in an expensive suit, representing himself in his petition for full custody of his 8-year-old daughter. On the other side stood Michael Torres, a 34-year-old former Army medic whose calloused hands and worn jacket told a story of a man who worked with his hands and his heart. The case seemed simple on paper. Richard was the biological father who had left when his daughter was just 2 years old, disappearing from her life without explanation or support. Michael was the stepfather who had married the girl's mother 5 years ago and had been the only father figure the child had ever really known. But 6 months ago, everything changed when a devastating car accident claimed the life of Sarah Torres and left her daughter Emma paralyzed from the waist down. Margaret had seen Richard's type before. Absent parents who suddenly reappeared when it was convenient or when there was something to gain. His petition claimed that Emma needed stability and financial security, things his 6-figure salary could provide that a physical therapist working at a veterans rehabilitation center could not. Michael's counterpetition was simpler and more heartfelt. Emma had already lost her mother, and taking away the only father she knew would destroy what remained of her shattered world. As the hearing progressed, Margaret listened to both sides present their arguments. Richard spoke eloquently about private schools, the best medical care money could buy, and a large home in the suburbs with a bedroom already prepared for Emma. He painted himself as a reformed man who had made mistakes but was now ready to step up and be the father his daughter deserved. His lawyer, a colleague he had brought for consultation, presented financial statements and psychological evaluations that portrayed Richard as stable, successful, and capable. When it was Michael's turn to speak, he stood slowly, his shoulders bearing the weight of potential loss. He didn't have fancy documents or impressive financial portfolios. Instead, he pulled out a worn photo album and began to describe his life with Emma and Sarah. He talked about teaching Emma to ride a bike, about helping her with homework at the kitchen table, about the way she called him Dad, even though they didn't share DNA. He described the accident with a voice that cracked with barely controlled emotion. How he had been the one to identify Sarah's body, how he had sat by Emma's hospital bed for 3 weeks straight, how he had held her hand when the doctors explained that she might never walk again. He spoke about the modifications he had made to their modest apartment, the wheelchair ramps he built himself, the way he had learned to braid Emma's hair because that's what Sarah used to do every morning before school. Margaret found herself moved by Michael's testimony, but she maintained her professional composure. The law was clear about biological parents' rights, and unless there was evidence of abuse or severe neglect, courts typically favored biological parents, especially when they could provide better financial circumstances. She was about to call a recess to review the case more thoroughly when Michael did something unexpected. He stepped forward, his voice suddenly urgent, and looked directly at Judge Harrison with an intensity that made her pause. "Your Honor, I know the law isn't on my side. I know I have no legal right to Emma, not really. But please, I'm begging you to listen to what I have to say." Margaret gestured for him to continue, curious about what could possibly change the trajectory of this case. Michael took a deep breath, and his next words came out in a rush of desperate hope. "That little girl has been in a wheelchair since the accident that took her mother. The doctors at County General said the nerve damage was too severe, that she would likely never walk again. But I've been researching her case, consulting with specialists I know from my time in the military, doctors who work with injured soldiers. I've studied her medical files, talked to physical therapists who specialize in spinal injuries. Your Honor, I know I can help her. I'm trained in advanced rehabilitation techniques I learned treating wounded soldiers in Afghanistan. Ma'am, I can make your daughter walk again." The words hung in the air like a lightning bolt, and Judge Margaret Harrison froze. The pen she had been holding slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the bench with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the suddenly silent courtroom. Her face, which had maintained judicial neutrality throughout the hearing, went pale. Her hands gripped the edge of the bench as if she needed it to remain upright. The court reporter stopped typing. The bailiff looked up in confusion. Even Richard Coleman sat forward, sensing that something profound had just happened, though he couldn't understand what. Michael noticed the judge's reaction, and confusion washed over his face. He glanced at his pro bono attorney, who looked equally bewildered. "Your Honor," he asked tentatively. "Are you all right?" Margaret's mind was reeling. She had heard thousands of statements in her courtroom over 2 decades, but these particular words, "I can make your daughter walk again," had struck her with the force of a physical blow. Not because of what Michael meant, but because of what she heard. Her daughter. The words echoed in her head, bouncing off memories she had buried deep for more than 2 decades. With trembling hands, she reached for her water glass and took a long drink, trying to compose herself. "Mr. Torres," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "please repeat what you just said." "Exactly as you said it." Michael, confused but compliant, repeated his statement. "I said I can make your daughter walk again, Your Honor. Emma. I know I can help her regain the ability to walk." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, something no one in that courtroom had ever seen from the notoriously composed Judge Harrison. She stood abruptly, and everyone else in the courtroom rose with her out of habit. "I need the medical records," she said, her voice shaking. "I need to see all of Emma's medical records right now." The attorneys exchanged bewildered glances, but Michael's lawyer quickly retrieved the thick folder of medical documentation from their table and approached the bench. Margaret's hands shook as she flipped through the pages. Birth certificate. Emma Grace Torres, born May 15th, 8 years ago. Mother's name. Sarah Marie Harrison Torres. Margaret's vision blurred as she stared at that middle name. Harrison. Her own surname. Her hands moved faster now, searching for more information. The death certificate for Sarah was there too, listing her age as 33, which would make her birth year exactly 23 years after Margaret's own mistake. Her own secret shame that she had carried every day of her life. She found Sarah's driver's license photo in the police report from the accident, and she gasped audibly. The young woman in the picture had Margaret's eyes, her nose, the same slight dimple in her left cheek that Margaret saw every morning in the mirror. "I need to recess this hearing," Margaret announced suddenly, standing so quickly that her chair rolled backward. "Bailiff, please clear the courtroom. I need to speak with Mr. Torres and Mr. Coleman privately in my chambers immediately." The bailiff, sensing the gravity of the situation, moved quickly to usher out the handful of observers. Within minutes, Margaret was in her chambers, pacing behind her desk while Michael and Richard stood awkwardly near the door, both utterly confused about what was happening. Margaret's usual composure had completely shattered. She pressed her hands against her desk, her head bowed, and when she finally looked up at Michael, tears were streaming down her face. "I need to tell you something that's going to sound impossible," she began, her voice breaking. 23 years ago, I was 17 years old. I was a senior in high school, top of my class, with a full scholarship to law school already lined up. And I got pregnant. Michael's eyes widened as he began to understand where this was going, but he remained silent, letting her continue. Margaret pulled open a locked drawer in her desk and removed a small box she had kept hidden for decades. Inside were papers. Adoption papers yellowed with age. "My parents gave me an ultimatum," she continued, her voice thick with emotion. "Give up the baby for adoption or lose everything. My college fund, my family, my future. They said I was too young, that a baby would ruin my life. I was scared and alone, and I made the choice that has haunted me every single day since." She spread the adoption papers on her desk. It was supposed to be a closed adoption. "I was told I would never know what happened to my baby girl, that it would be better for everyone if I just moved on with my life. So I did. I went to college, then law school. I became a family court judge because I thought I could protect children, make sure they ended up in homes where they were loved and wanted. But not a day went by that I didn't think about her, didn't wonder where she was, if she was happy, if she was loved." Michael sank into a chair, his face reflecting the impossibility of what he was hearing. Margaret pulled out more documents, her own birth certificate, medical records, everything she had kept from that time. The adoption was arranged through St. Catherine's Agency in 1992. The baby was born on March 3rd. I held her for exactly 10 minutes before they took her away. That's all I was allowed. She looked directly at Michael now. "Your wife, Sarah. When was she born?" Michael's voice was barely audible. "March 3rd, 1992. She was adopted as an infant. She never knew her birth mother. The room fell completely silent except for the sound of Margaret's quiet crying. Richard Coleman, who had been watching this unfold with increasing shock, finally spoke. "This is highly irregular, Your Honor. You can't seriously be suggesting." Margaret cut him off with a sharp look. "Mr. Coleman, I am going to order DNA tests immediately. But I already know what they're going to say. That little girl you're fighting over is my granddaughter. The daughter your petition claims you want custody of, she's my granddaughter." Over the next 2 hours, in the privacy of her chambers, Margaret shared everything she had kept locked away for more than 2 decades. She showed them letters she had written to her unknown daughter over the years. Letters she never sent but couldn't bring herself to throw away. She described the grief and guilt that had shaped her entire career, the way every custody case felt personal because she had given away her own child. Michael sat in stunned silence, processing the impossible coincidence that had brought him into the courtroom of his late wife's biological mother. Margaret turned to him with desperate eyes. "Tell me about Sarah. Please. Tell me about my daughter's life." Through his own tears, Michael painted a picture of the woman he had loved. Sarah had been adopted by John and Patricia Harrison, a kind couple from Michigan who had loved her deeply and given her a wonderful childhood. She had become a teacher, specializing in special education because she wanted to help children who struggled. She had married young the first time to Richard, but that marriage had fallen apart when he prioritized his career over his family. She had been a single mother for 3 years before meeting Michael at a veterans support group where she volunteered. They had fallen in love slowly, carefully, both of them carrying their own wounds, hers from a failed marriage, his from what he had seen in combat. "She was the kindest person I've ever known," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "She made me believe in second chances. She made me want to be better than I was. And Emma is just like her. Smart, compassionate, stubborn as hell when she believes in something." He pulled out his phone and showed Margaret pictures. Sarah and Emma at the beach, Emma's first day of school, the 3 of them at Emma's dance recital just 2 months before the accident. Margaret stared at the photos of the daughter she had never known, seeing her own features reflected in Sarah's face, seeing her own mother's smile in Emma's grin. "I gave her up to give her a better life," Margaret whispered. "Did she have one? Was she happy?" Michael nodded emphatically. "She had a beautiful life. Her adoptive parents adored her. She died knowing she was loved, doing what she loved. She was driving home from a school event when a drunk driver hit her car. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't right, but her life before that moment was full of joy and love and purpose." The DNA tests that were ordered came back 2 weeks later, but by then, everyone involved already knew the truth. Margaret shared 99.9% of her DNA with Emma Torres. The little girl in the wheelchair fighting for custody was indeed her granddaughter, the only piece of her daughter that remained in the world. The case took on a complexity that no law book could fully address. Margaret immediately recused herself, but she filed a lengthy recommendation for the judge who would take over the case. In it, she detailed Michael's character, his dedication to Emma, and the fact that he had been the girl's father in every way that mattered for more than 5 years. She also included something else, a petition for grandparent visitation rights and a request that Emma's wishes be taken into account given her age and the traumatic circumstances. The new judge, Robert Chen, handled the case with sensitivity and care. He interviewed Emma privately, and what she said sealed the case. The 8-year-old, mature beyond her years from grief and pain, was clear and unwavering. Michael was her dad, the only real dad she had ever known, and she wanted to stay with him. She barely remembered Richard, and the idea of living with a stranger, even a biological stranger, terrified her. Judge Chen ruled in Michael's favor, granting him full custody with Richard receiving supervised visitation rights that could be expanded over time if he proved committed to building a genuine relationship with his daughter. But the real story was just beginning. Margaret, retired from the bench specifically to navigate this complicated new family dynamic, met her granddaughter for the first time on a sunny Saturday afternoon at the small apartment Michael and Emma called home. Emma was nervous, sitting in her wheelchair near the window, when Margaret knocked on the door. Michael had prepared her carefully, explaining that this was her mom's birth mother, a grandmother she had never known existed. When Margaret walked in, she knelt down immediately to Emma's eye level, tears already streaming down her face. "Hi, Emma," she said softly. I'm your Grandma Margaret. I know this is all very strange and confusing, but I want you to know something important. Your mother was the baby I held for 10 minutes 23 years ago, and even though I never got to know her, I loved her every single day of my life. And now I get a chance to know you, and I promise you, I'm going to love you just as fiercely. Emma studied this stranger carefully, seeing something familiar in her eyes that she couldn't quite name. My mom used to say that family isn't just about blood, Emma said quietly. She said family is about who shows up and who stays. Margaret smiled through her tears. Your mother was very wise. And I'm showing up now, sweetheart. I'm here, and I'm staying. Over the following months, the three of them, Michael, Margaret, and Emma, formed an unlikely family unit built on shared grief and unexpected grace. Margaret sold her large house and bought a smaller one closer to Michael's apartment, with a first-floor bedroom modified for wheelchair access where Emma could stay on weekends. But more importantly, Michael made good on his promise. He hadn't just been offering empty hope in that courtroom. He had genuinely researched Emma's specific injury and consulted with the best physical therapists and neurologists he knew from his military network. Emma's injury wasn't a complete spinal cord transection. There was some nerve connectivity remaining, which meant there was hope for recovery with intensive, specialized therapy. Michael became Emma's primary physical therapist, working with her every single day. The process was grueling and painful. There were sessions where Emma cried and wanted to quit, where the pain was too much and the progress too slow. But Michael was there for every moment, encouraging her, pushing her when she needed pushing, and knowing when to let her rest. Margaret was there too, helping with the exercises, reading to Emma during the difficult recovery periods, and providing the kind of grandmother's love and support that Emma had been missing since both her adoptive grandparents had passed away. Progress came in tiny increments. First, Emma regained some sensation in her toes. Then, small movements. Michael worked with her on strengthening exercises, nerve stimulation therapy, and cutting-edge treatments that combined his military medical training with civilian rehabilitation techniques. 6 months after that fateful courtroom encounter, Emma stood up from her wheelchair for the first time, supported by parallel bars and with both Michael and Margaret on either side of her. Her legs shook with the effort, and she could only hold the position for 30 seconds, but the entire therapy room erupted in applause. Emma burst into tears. Tears of pain, yes, but also tears of hope and triumph. I'm standing, she whispered in disbelief. I'm actually standing. Michael hugged her carefully, supporting her weight. You're doing more than standing, kiddo. You're fighting. You're being brave. Your mom would be so proud of you. On Emma's 9th birthday, exactly 1 year after the custody hearing that changed everything, something extraordinary happened. Margaret had organized a small party at her house, with just a few of Emma's school friends and some of Michael's colleagues from the VA hospital. Emma had been using a walker for the past 2 months, able to move short distances with support. But she had been secretly practicing something with Michael for weeks, wanting to surprise her grandmother. As everyone gathered to sing, "Happy Birthday," Emma stood up from her wheelchair. Michael stood nearby, ready to catch her if needed, but he didn't help. Step by careful step, Emma walked across the room, 10 full steps without any support, and hugged Margaret around the waist. The room fell completely silent except for the sound of people crying. Emma looked up at her grandmother with a triumphant smile. Surprise, Grandma. I walked to you. Margaret knelt down, holding Emma tight, overwhelmed by the miracle she was witnessing. This child, her granddaughter, had overcome impossible odds through sheer determination, expert care, and the unwavering support of a father who wasn't bound by biology but by something far stronger. The journey wasn't over. Emma still had difficult days. She still used her wheelchair sometimes when fatigue or pain made walking too difficult. But she had regained enough strength and mobility to live a mostly normal life. She returned to school, walked in her 4th grade talent show, and even joined an adaptive dance.